She was used to living in the shadows, used to being invisible to everyone around her. But that wasn't the case this time. Her intuition, which she had developed over the years, told her that today would be different. Her every move was premeditated. It was as if she knew that she would be looked at with judgment, that even her presence in this neighborhood was a challenge that someone was about to decide to accept. Despite her young age, there was fire in her eyes, and there was something in the way she moved that made the sky above her head tremble. 1 second, and the world changed. As she passed a parked car, a hard, threatening look suddenly flashed in her direction. A man in uniform, one of those who's supposed to protect but in reality is often a threat. He stood by his patrol car, leaning forward slightly, scrutinizing her every move. It wasn't just a look, it was a judgment. He already knew what she'd done wrong before she could say a word. The policeman took a step in her direction, his boots clattering on the sidewalk, the sharp sound like it cut her off from the world. She stopped, feeling his energy bombard her with animosity. No matter who she was, no matter what she did, her skin spoke for her. "What are you doing here?" His voice was low and threatening, like a dictator ready to pass judgment without a trial. She tried not to show fear or fatigue, not to give him what he expected to see. Her inner core did not waver. Passing by, her reply was simple, but there was a strength in it that wasn't immediately apparent. She stood steady, ignoring his aggressive behavior. But he didn't back down. He stepped even closer, and her nerves clenched like a taut string. "Do you even realize where you are? You don't belong here," he said slowly, as if every word he spoke could tear her apart. Her heart skipped a few beats. She knew that if he decided to check her ID, she would be at his mercy. He could break her right there without even trying to justify his actions. And then he stepped forward, placing his hand on her shoulder with the strength to hold her back. She felt his fingers digging into her skin, and pain coursed through her, but she didn't let herself flinch. It was all so familiar. This pain, this humiliating aggression. Over the years, she'd learned to tolerate that kind of touch, but every time it felt new, searing like the first time. Her breath caught, and she instinctively clenched her fists, ready to defend herself. He seemed to anticipate her reaction, like a predator sneaking up on its prey. "We don't need people like you here." His words, cold and cruel, were like a knife to her heart. She felt her soul begin to sink under the weight of those words, but she couldn't let herself be broken. She knew she had only one chance, not to give him a reason for more violence. With each step he took, she felt more and more tension, her rib cage clenching with fear. He was ready to break her, but she knew, if she gave in, this world wouldn't be for her. All she had accomplished was dust. Everything she'd fought for would come crashing down in the blink of an eye. But then, at the very moment when her body was ready to surrender under the weight of his will, she felt her hand involuntarily touch the cold metal badge hidden in the pocket of her jacket. At that instant, the air around her became denser. The policeman noticed her movement. He stopped, and his gaze became tense, like a taut string. There was a shadow of doubt in his eyes, as if the world had suddenly lost its clarity. From that moment on, everything changed. She kept walking, not realizing that her steps were leading her to a new challenge. With every second, the feeling of uncertainty she tried to drown out grew stronger. Passers-by looked around silently, their looks saying more than words, but they didn't dare to interfere. She was not her own in this neighborhood. She knew that her face, her gait, her skin, it all seemed foreign, dangerous to this place. She was used to the cold silence, used to being shunned. But today, something was wrong. The policeman standing on the corner first noticed her from the second she entered his field of vision. He knew she shouldn't be here. He knew she was not someone who was allowed to walk these streets. His gaze, full of contempt and arrogance, slid over her figure. She felt everything inside her tense up. Intuitively, she knew it wasn't just a glance. It was the beginning of something dangerous. He approached her slowly. Each step was fear-filled. No greetings, no formalities. He wasn't going to be polite. Her perception of time slowed. Everything was happening as if the world around her was shrinking. She knew this moment could be crucial. "What are you doing here?" His voice was low, sounding like a sentence. He wasn't asking. He was asserting. There was no interest or curiosity in his words, only indifference and cruelty. The policeman did not wait for an answer. He waited for her to justify herself so that he could humiliate her even more. He was sure of his power. She replied calmly, trying not to give away the anxiety in her voice. "I'm just going." But there was still a touch of fear lurking in her voice. She tried to find the strength not to give up her position, not to let him sense her weakness. But he already knew she was black. He saw her as a threat before she even uttered a word. It wasn't just suspicion. It was racism written into his very nature. "You don't decide where you're going to be," he said, leaning toward her, and his face was only a few centimeters from hers. She felt his breath pierce her, as his gaze cut her to the bone. He began to say, quietly but inexorably, "You're out of your neighborhood, bitch. You shouldn't be here." She took a step back, trying to avoid the conflict, but that only fueled his rage. His hand suddenly gripped her wrist with such force that she felt her bones begin to crack. He wasn't ready to let her go, even when she tried to break free. "Are you going to fight back?" His shout made the bystanders retreat, but no one dared to interfere. There was nothing but contempt and anger in his eyes anymore. He knew she had no right to stand before him, and every protest she made was a betrayal to him. The policeman tore her toward him, slapping her in response to her attempts to resist. He shouted racial slurs with fury, each word cutting her off from her life, from her dignity. She felt her body being squeezed by his strength, but the inner rage hidden behind her calmness only grew stronger. "Do you even realize what you look like?" he hissed again and again, pushing harder at every word she said. She knew her words couldn't stop him, that she was just a victim here. Unable to hold back, he pushed her toward the sidewalk. She collapsed to the pavement, losing her balance. The ground proved as cruel as his words. It wasn't just a fall, it was a feeling of utter humiliation, when every step she took, every movement seemed to him a mistake for which there was no forgiveness. "Serves you right, bitch. Who gave you the right to even—" His words didn't stop. They grew more and more fierce. Each blow to her was not only physical, but psychological as well. He didn't realize that she couldn't just walk away, that she was part of this fight, part of the whole system he personified. She, lying on the ground, felt her face hot with tears, but a fire burned in her eyes. She knew that she could not give up, that it was in these cruel moments that she must find the strength to continue to resist. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you are listening to our stories from and whether there was something similar in your life. We'd love to hear your experiences. If you like what we're doing, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new stories. And now we continue. He stood over her like a giant shadow blocking out the light. She lay on the ground, trying to get up, but his hand clamped her to the pavement again, stopping her from breathing. Every gesture he made was infused with rage, every look with hatred. The policeman seemed to see her not as a woman, but as an object, the embodiment of his anger and helplessness. She could feel her muscles clenching, the air becoming heavy and viscous, her chest squeezing under the pressure. He wasn't going to let her go, wasn't going to let go, not even for a moment. "You don't belong on these streets, do you understand?" His words sounded like a judgment, like something final that there was no point in challenging. He stared at her, as if enjoying her helplessness, as if her fear was his victory. "I didn't do anything wrong." Her voice was barely audible, but there was power in it, latent like a volcano ready to erupt. She tried to say something that would somehow justify her existence in his eyes, but she knew it didn't matter to him. He didn't want to hear it. He wanted to see her humiliation. The policeman stepped closer. His face was so close that she felt his hot breath burning her skin. "Who do you think you are?" His voice became a whisper, but there was a threat in it that her life, her future, her freedom was just a toy in his hands. He took hold of her hair and yanked it upward with force, making her eyes meet his. She felt the pain in her head, in her chest, in her arms, but the worst part was that it didn't make her feelings any easier. No, she couldn't afford to be weak. She tried to get up, but every step she took was thrown back by his strength. He was one step ahead of her. He was ready to humiliate her to the end. "You deserve nothing but to sit in your corner." His words sounded like poison arrows piercing her soul. His hand squeezed her chin, lifting her face up, forcing her to look into his eyes. She tried to pull away, but his strength was overwhelming, and with every move he made, she felt her inner world shrinking. But she didn't give up. With every word, with every gesture of the policeman, her heart did not give up. She gathered her strength despite the growing sense of fear and pain, despite his rage. She knew she had to hold on, that this moment would be a test not only for her body, but for her soul as well. "You're nothing. Just a black woman who shouldn't be here." His words tore at her soul, but she wouldn't let herself cry. He didn't see her as a person. He saw her as his victim, his excuse for all his fears and hatred. He saw her only as part of the system he wanted to control, to destroy, to break. She couldn't understand why people like him felt stronger when they only saw the other person as their weakness. Why they could do whatever they wanted and think their actions were justified. She tried to say something even though she knew it wouldn't stop him. She couldn't let him win, couldn't let him break her. The policeman grabbed her arm again, squeezing her to the limit, making her feel vulnerable. But despite everything, despite all the insults and blows, she didn't stop fighting. There was something inside her that made her stand. She fought not only for her freedom, but also for her dignity. Every step she took was a desperate attempt not to lose herself, not to lose her humanity in this hell. Her heart was hammering in her chest, blood pounding in her temples, but she held on. Even as the cop became even more aggressive, his hand sliding down her neck, squeezing her breath, she didn't let herself give up. She knew that if she fell, she wouldn't get up, and despite all the pain, despite all the threat, she kept fighting. Because if she didn't fight, she wouldn't be human, and it was in that very moment that she felt her strength and determination grow. Her breathing was getting heavier, as if all she could feel in this moment was his hands clutching her, his hate-filled gaze, and the words that rolled like thunderstorms through her mind. He was one step ahead of her, and she could feel her body squeezing under his presence. But his words. His words were what pierced through to her very soul. "Who do you think you are to tell me anything? I mean, you're just dirt. This place isn't for the likes of you." His words continued to sound like blows. Each one of their blows felt in her skin as if he was ripping out her identity, her dignity, and stomping on them with his feet. Every look he gave her, full of contempt, made her feel like her whole life was a mistake. "I didn't do anything wrong." Her voice was weak, but there was hardness in it, a desperate attempt to protect what was still left of her human dignity. She couldn't keep quiet. Something was burning in her heart, something that wouldn't let her give up, something that demanded justice despite the injustice of the world. "What the hell do you know about justice, you goddamn bitch?" He leaned toward her again, his face almost beside hers, and he spewed torrents of filthy words at her. His rage was crashing down on her like a waterfall, and she felt her world crumbling. She was just a woman, just a person, but to him she was just a dirty stain on the ground. Her torture continued, and in his eyes she saw not only aggression, but absolute contempt. His cruelty was overly blatant, and she couldn't understand how a man who swore to protect could be so inhuman. She felt her rib cage clenching, her soul suffering, but she didn't back down. "Aren't you scared, bitch?" His hand squeezed her chin even tighter, forcing her to look him in the eye. His rage wasn't just disgust, it was a personal grudge. He couldn't tolerate her existence, couldn't accept that she stood before him, neither broken nor humiliated. His former authority had been shattered, and all that remained was an attempt to regain control, to regain at least a small victory, whatever that might be. "You have no right to treat me like this." Her voice finally broke through the fear and pain. But the policeman didn't stop. He only grinned. "You have no right? Do you even realize where you are, you goddamn bitch?" His words were getting more and more aggressive. He started yelling. "You don't belong here, and you don't get to decide what you do. You should know your place, and your place is under the fingernails of people like me." She felt his every phrase, his every word piercing her, as if he were tearing not just words out of her, but her very self. But she wouldn't give up. She couldn't. This wasn't just resistance. It was her final appeal to her humanity. It was her rebellion, her protest against all that the world, this policeman and the whole system were trying to take from her. But despite all her resistance, she could feel reality beginning to overwhelm her. There was something in his eyes that wouldn't let her win. He was part of a system that stood his ground. He knew her voice was nothing more than noise. He knew her attempts would be lost in this cruel world. "Did you think anyone would protect you?" He looked at her mockingly, and there was such coldness in his eyes, such soulless fire. "Everyone here knows who's on whose side, so keep your mouth shut before you get any worse." He pushed her to the ground again, and she felt her heart, her mind, everything she had once thought solid and safe crumble. This world was foreign to her, and she was completely alone. His power was so immense that she felt it in her every move. Every word, every look, every threat brought her to her knees. But despite all this, despite all the pain, she knew one thing: she would not be broken. Even if her life was consumed by this world, she would fight to the last, because her strength was not only her body, but her spirit as well. And this policeman, the whole system behind him, couldn't take away her humanity. The policeman, feeling his impunity, stepped toward her again. He was at the height of his rage, his face contorted with hatred, his breathing becoming heavier and heavier. He was no longer trying to hide his intentions. He was ready to tear her apart, and she knew it. She didn't have the power to stop him, but an inextinguishable fire raged inside her that refused to give way. It was the worst moment of her life, the moment when physical pain became not just the result of violence, but a symbol of her humiliation. The policeman undermined her last attempts at resistance. He grabbed her by the shoulders and pushed her to the ground without mercy. She felt her body hit the hard surface, her head meeting the asphalt with a thud. The impact was so hard that her eyes went dark for a moment. Her ears rumbled, her body frozen with shock. She tried to get up, but he was faster. He stepped on her arm, pinning her to the ground so she couldn't move. He looked at her as if she were something low, a piece of dirt to be destroyed. He made no secret of his contempt, his face contorted with malice and cruelty. "That's the way you should be. You're not worth anything. Look at you, a black woman trying to prove something to someone." His words rained down on her like hammers. Each one stabbed into her heart like a knife. He savored her misery, savored the way she was losing her last strength. She tried to rise, but his legs squeezed her again, holding her in place. She felt his weight becoming unbearable to her. He pressed her face to the ground, and in that moment she felt not only his physical strength, but the weight of a world that seemed unfair and cruel. Every gesture he made was calculated to strip her of her dignity, to show her that she was nothing. "You think someone's going to help you?" He leaned over her, his face so close she could feel his stinking breath. "You're out here all alone, you know. And the system is on my side, so be thankful you're still alive." Every word he said cut her, but what hurt even more was that there wasn't a shadow of doubt in his eyes. He was sure he was right, that her life didn't matter. He didn't feel that she was a person. To him, she was just an object, a convenient target for all his accumulated anger. He was sure she had nowhere to run, that she couldn't leave, that she would remain silent. And if she didn't stay silent, she would simply cease to exist. Her skin burned from his touch, every movement of his body leaving a mark on her body. He began to scream, raising his voice, humiliating her even more, making her feel her human dignity crumble into tiny pieces. Every word he spoke was a threat, an insult, a torture. "You must have thought the world was fair, huh? You're so unlucky on your hide. You deserve nothing but to lie here like a grain of sand in a field that's easily shredded." Her heart was racing, but she couldn't let herself give up. She knew that if she gave in, all would be lost. It wasn't just physical pain. It was a humiliation of her very essence, of her everything. She had to endure, because if she didn't, if she broke, this cop, this system, this world would take everything from her. Her future, her right to freedom, her right to be a human being, all of it would be trampled on if she didn't fight. Despite all the pain, despite the way her body squirmed under his weight, she gathered her last strength. She felt her hands clench into fists as her every breath became a fight for life. She couldn't let him win. She couldn't let him take away the last corner of her humanity. She raised her head, her gaze meeting his. His eyes were clear. He wanted to destroy her, to wipe her off the face of the earth. But there was something else in her eyes, something unbroken. Her words, quiet and pain-filled but full of strength, broke through her throat. "I will not be your victim." And in that moment, she realized that her body and her will might be broken, but her spirit would never give in. He stood over her like a giant, his body looming over her, pulling a heavy atmosphere of menace and fear. His anger knew no bounds. and now he was sure of his victory. She lay defeated by his strength, her breathing hitching, each breath like a knife stabbing into her rib cage. His gaze was predatory, his lips curved in a contemptuous grin. "Who do you think you are?" His voice shook with rage. He didn't try to hide the fact that she was nothing to him. "You bitch! You don't even have the right to stand in front of me. You deserve nothing but to be down in the dirt where you belong." Her face burned, every stroke of his words penetrating her like arrows. She couldn't get up, couldn't fight back, and his brutality, backed by his power, was the most horrible thing she'd ever felt. He was sure that his uniform, his badge, was the justification for all his actions. She was just an object for his humiliation, just a thing he could torture at will. Her body shook with pain, but it wasn't just the physical brutality that tore at her soul even more. It was the way he was overriding her identity. He wasn't even giving her a chance to speak, not even to justify herself. He wasn't going to listen to her. He didn't want to know her name, didn't want to understand who she was. He only saw her as a representative of what he thought was dirty and wrong in this world. "You know what?" He leaned toward her, his breath burning her face. "You're nothing. You can be anything you want to be, but to me, you'll only remain a black wench who thinks she can stand in my way. I'm the one who determines what's right and what's wrong. And you," he snorted, glaring at her contemptuously, "you're just a lowlife that I can destroy any way I want." Her heart was pounding in her chest. The pain in her stomach was unbearable, and every look, every word of that policeman evoked in her a terror she had never felt before. But somewhere inside, deep down, despite all the humiliation, despite the pain that brought tears to her eyes, there was something that wouldn't let her give up. Her hands clenched into fists. He might be able to break her body, but her spirit was her own, and no one could take it, even if she was on her knees before him. This wasn't just resistance. It was her opposition not just to him, but to everything this system represented. Everything he thought about her, everything he did to her body, didn't define her, wasn't her. He couldn't understand that. He couldn't understand that she was not his prey, not his property. She was human, and her dignity was on her side no matter what he did. "Look, I don't need your excuses." He didn't hear her words, didn't want to hear them. His own imagination, his power was a reality to him, and he felt his confidence growing with every humiliation he suffered. He was sure he had won, that she could no longer speak or resist. She was simply the object of his anger. But her words, weak, trembling with pain, still broke through. I'm not your victim." The policeman was silent for a moment, his eyes narrowed, and for a second his confidence wavered. He hadn't expected that answer. She hadn't given up, despite everything he'd done to her. She stood before him despite the physical pain, despite the humiliation, despite all his threats. It was her small victory, her ability to survive, to hold on to her human essence. But the policeman could not afford to lose control. His rage was growing. He leaned toward her again, pressing even harder on her shoulder, feeling his power tearing her apart. He was sure she wouldn't be able to stand. He was sure it would be up to him now. He wanted her to feel that her life, her dignity, her rights, none of it mattered. "You have no right, Black." His voice became gnarled. "You don't belong here. You're nothing, and you'll never be human in my eyes." Her body was on edge, and for a moment she thought it was over. But inside her, somewhere far away, in the very depths of her pain, There was a voice that said, "I will fight. I will survive." He squeezed her wrist once more, trying to crush her, to break her, but she felt her spirit continue to resist. This was her fight, not with him, but with this world that was trying to destroy her. And despite everything, despite all the pain, she knew one thing: she would not give in. Let's take another quick pause. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from, and whether you've had something similar in your life. We'd love to hear your experiences. If you like what we're doing, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new stories. And now we continue. She lay on the pavement, exhausted, immobilized by his power, but something inside her was burning. Everything around her seemed dark and empty, her consciousness beginning to drown in pain, and her breathing growing heavier each time. His hands squeezed her so tight she thought her bones were about to crack. His words were like spits in her face, demeaning, insulting, making her feel like nothing. He was sure of his victory, and he didn't hide it. "You don't fight back anymore. Don't waste your strength, Black." His voice was low and filled with anger. "You are already broken. You're under my control, and nothing will change that." Her eyes were full of pain, but there was rage in them too. Everything he said was just another blow, another way to strip her of her dignity. But she didn't give up. She felt his words burning her, his hands clenching her, but deep inside she still felt human, despite everything he'd done to her. Her consciousness was sharpened to the limit, and in that moment, despite all the pain and humiliation, she felt a strange calmness. This moment seemed to be her end, her downfall, but it was actually the moment when everything was beginning to change. There was something strange, something new in his gaze that was centered on her face. She noticed it, a moment when his confidence in his power wavered. He was wary. He sensed something. She couldn't understand what exactly had changed in his demeanor, but his cruelty eased for a second. She saw how his gaze became restless, how the confidence with which he had humiliated her suddenly began to fade. It was like a change in the weather, first wind, then clouds, then calm, and then, suddenly, he froze. He pulled away from her slightly, as if something had stopped him, as if he himself sensed something was going on. It was almost imperceptible, but she noticed. She felt his hand, which a moment ago had been clutching her throat, loosen slightly, and his gaze, focused, was now pondering. She felt his body tense up, as if he knew that something was wrong here, that he was on the verge of something much bigger than he had imagined. Her eyes remained closed, but she felt his attention. She held her breath without moving, and in that moment she felt something begin to change in her body. Her inner world was becoming clearer with each passing second, and it was as if the pain was becoming more distant. It wasn't just a physical release, it was a release of spirit. She knew he was wrong. He thought she could be broken. He thought it would be over, but she was still fighting. He hadn't won yet. She was stronger than he could have imagined. The policeman probably felt his confidence begin to crumble, and perhaps his inner world was telling him something. He pulled away from her a little, not realizing what was happening. A shadow of doubt appeared on his face, and she could see it. It wasn't just fear of the unknown. It was the realization that his strength, his power, his fear, they didn't matter. She was no longer just a victim anymore. Her gaze, full of pain, was now full of determination. He tried to return to his earlier threats, but his voice shook and his confidence was shattered. His words, which should have humiliated her again, now sounded like empty threats. She sensed the uncertainty in his voice, an uncertainty he couldn't hide. You can't." His voice trailed off, and his hand squeezed hers again, but now with less force. She could feel his grip weakening, his gaze losing its hold. He was no longer the man he had been moments ago. He could no longer control her the way he used to. There was more than racism and contempt in his eyes. There was fear there now. He realized that she wasn't what he thought she was. She was stronger than he had ever imagined. And that realization was his defeat. Her inner world was filled with solidity, even despite her position. With each breath, she felt her strength returning. With every second he was losing his power, she began to gather the strength to stand up, even if it cost her everything. He didn't know yet that she was much stronger than he could have imagined. And in that moment, when things were beginning to change, when his grip loosened, she felt her heart beat faster, her body, despite the pain, still able to fight. There was doubt in his eyes, and that doubt was his to lose. When her body was on edge, when her strength was waning and every breath seemed agonizing. At some point, her hand, which had been under the heavy pressure of his leg, involuntarily touched the cold metal in her jacket pocket. A slight, almost imperceptible gesture, but that very moment was the turning point. The moment her fingers touched the edge of the hidden FBI badge, something froze in her mind. She felt something begin to change. Her body could no longer keep her afloat, but inside, somewhere deep, a new fire was lit in her eyes. The policeman continued to stand over her, his anger unabated. His words were like bullets piercing her consciousness. He was sure of his power, sure that she couldn't resist, that her weakness was obvious. "Are you still trying to fight back, bitch?" His face was contorted with contempt. "Don't you see that you're nothing? You're black, and your life isn't worth a dime." She gritted her teeth, not letting him hear the groan that was about to escape, but her gaze grew wary as soon as her fingers felt that cold metal. For a moment, her mind focused on the badge, and a hidden power surged through her body. She felt that small metal piece of jewelry become her hope, her last line of defense. The policeman noticed it. His gaze, which had seemed relentlessly cruel and focused on humiliating her, suddenly froze, and he backed away for a moment. It was a moment she used to gather her remaining strength and, as if instinctively, move her hand so that he would notice what she was hiding from him. The FBI badge embedded in her jacket gleamed in the dim light. The policeman froze. His eyes narrowed and his expression changed momentarily. He looked at her with a confusion that interrupted the flow of his rage for a moment. His breathing became confused, as if he had suddenly realized something incredible. What is it?" His voice became quiet but strained. He froze, as if he couldn't believe what he had just seen. Everything he knew about her being just a black woman to be humiliated and suppressed, suddenly didn't matter. He began to realize that what he had in front of him was not just a victim, but someone far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. She felt his grip loosening, his confidence beginning to melt. He didn't know how to react. Fear flashed in his eyes for a second, and it was a victory. He was beginning to realize that everything he said, everything he did, didn't really matter. His status, his uniform, his weapons, none of it could take away from what he had just noticed about her. She wasn't just a woman. She was something much more. Are you FBI?" His voice shook again, and that was his defeat. He didn't know what to do with this knowledge that he had become a threat to someone who stood far above him, who was part of the system, but not as he saw it. His racist views, his aggression, and his desire to destroy anything that had to do with her skin color, all of that disappeared under the weight of this discovery. Her eyes met his, and she felt her gaze grow sharp and insistent. Everything he'd said before, everything he'd tried to do, made no sense now. In his eyes, she read not only the consternation, but the uncertainty that was his downfall. He was no longer at the mercy of the situation. He felt his confidence begin to crumble. Yes, her voice was hoarse with pain, but there was something in it he hadn't expected to hear. I'm the FBI, and you're probably wrong to think you can squeeze me. I'm not your toy. Another realization flashed in his eyes. He couldn't believe that his rage and humiliation had been directed against someone higher than him. He was still trying to find words to justify his actions, but now they sounded like empty noise. He had lost control. Everything he had tried to construct in his head had collapsed. Her heart beat loudly, and she could feel the strength returning to her body. She climbed a little higher, though her body was exhausted to the point of exhaustion. But now she was ready to fight back. She was no longer just a victim. She had become a symbol of resistance, a symbol that even in the darkest moments there was a chance for light. He stood before her, shocked and stunned. He no longer knew how to act. Her gaze was more than a threat to him. It was a reminder that strength isn't always about pushing and humiliating. Sometimes real strength is in standing up and saying you're a human being, no matter what the world tries to take away from you. It was her last weapon. The policeman took a step back. His face, which had just expressed brutal confidence, was now contorted with fear. It was as if he had awakened from a nightmare in which he had been certain that he had control, that his authority was inviolable. But now, in this moment, as his gaze fell on the FBI badge, his confidence began to melt like snow under a blazing sun. He took another step back, as if trying to hide from what he had just seen. The fear he felt wasn't just fear of the unexpected discovery. It was fear for his life. This fear filled his soul because he realized he was not just an aggressor, not just a cop who was trying to impose his power. He was a man who had humiliated not just a woman, but someone who stood far above him. Her gaze, the point of which had penetrated his shell, now seemed deadly to him. She didn't say a word, but there was a fire in her eyes that he couldn't put out. He felt his power fading away as he lost everything he thought he was entitled to. He was unprepared for this encounter, unprepared for the fact that his aggression might turn against himself. I didn't know. His voice shook, and he took another step back, as if trying to escape his own conscience. He was embarrassed, confused, but the worst part was the realization in his eyes that he couldn't justify his actions. You didn't know? Her voice was low but full of power. You humiliated me. You thought I was nothing, and you thought all your words and actions were okay. You were sure you could break me because I'm black, but you were wrong. Every word she uttered was like a knife's edge, penetrating his soul, making him realize that everything he had done was not just wrong, but monstrously cruel. He tried to justify himself, but the words wouldn't come. He wasn't just guilty. He was raped by his own conscience. He couldn't wash himself clean of what he had done. He couldn't undo what he'd done to her, the pain, the humiliation she'd suffered. I didn't mean it. His words sounded like an excuse, but they had no force. He couldn't believe that this person who stood before him wasn't just someone he considered inferior. She was part of the system, part of something bigger than his aggression. But at this level of realization, there was no turning back anymore. He didn't just see a woman. He saw a man who was far more powerful than he had ever imagined. And his actions were now not only a crime, they were a personal defeat. "You still think it's justified?" Her question was as direct as a punch. She was ready to tear this moment to shreds. With every word she said, he could feel his guilt becoming more and more real, drowning in his own racism that he couldn't justify in any way. Every humiliation, every insult he had inflicted on her was now not just a crime, it was becoming a moral failure. He could no longer look her in the eye. He felt disgusted with himself. His own hands, the very hands that had inflicted the violence, seemed dirty to him now, marked by the humiliation he had created. He pulled away, feeling more and more the fear and shame filling his heart. "Do you realize what you've done?" His question was not to her, but to himself. He, who had once been confident of his impunity, now realized that he could not escape from his guilt. He had thought his power over her was absolute, but now everything had changed. He was weak, more vulnerable than ever. He stood there, trembling, as if he had become a stranger in this world. Everything he'd done to her was now coming down on him. And even if he tried to justify his aggression, his inner realization was stronger. He hadn't just lost control of the situation, he had lost his humanity. "You can't take back what you've done." Her words weren't a threat. They were a statement of fact. She understood that her suffering could not erase his guilt, that no amount of his apologies could give her back what he had taken. And her gaze was not only a look of pain, but a look of strength. The policeman was silent. He did not know what to do with this power. He knew that he could never justify his actions, that his humiliation had no forgiveness. And in that silence, in that realization, he began to realize that his life had already changed. He was no longer a policeman who could control everything. Now he was a man standing in front of a woman who had endured his hatred and was destroying her aggression simply by remaining standing. She got up from the ground. Every movement of her body was filled with pain, but there was a fire burning in her eyes. The policeman stood a few feet away from her, his face weary with fear and remorse. But inside her there was no regret or compassion for his fall. She knew he would never realize the full depth of what he had done, but today he felt that for all his humiliation and violence, there was payback. He felt that he could no longer be who he used to be, and although his actions could not be undone, something in him had changed. He stood like a stone statue, watching her as she slowly backed away. His breathing was heavy, his gaze helpless. He didn't know how to say anything to her, how to justify his actions. Her words, her look of determination and pain flashed through his mind. Everything he had once believed to be true was now falling apart. "You can't go on like this." Her words sounded like a sentence he couldn't argue with. "You've already broken more than just me. You've broken yourself." Those words were the last ones she said to him, and with them, she left without looking back. The policeman stood, his body tense, as if ready to collapse from everything that had just happened. He couldn't understand what was going to happen to him now. He couldn't hide from what he had done. The woman was gone, leaving him in that forgotten shadow, and despite his best efforts to justify himself, his pride was destroyed like glass shattered into 1,000 shards. She didn't see him anymore. He was just a part of the past, a part of what she had left behind. But there was relief inside her, but also the realization that her struggle was just beginning. She knew that she hadn't won just now. She had only won this moment, this clash, but her journey was long and hard. She couldn't stop because her enemy was alive. It was changing shape, but not disappearing. And as she walked away, leaving behind that moment of triumph, she felt her own freedom fill her with strength with each step. She knew that perhaps her path would be difficult, that she would have to face people like this again, but now she was ready, because she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been humiliated, everyone who had ever been victimized by violence and hatred. The policeman remained standing, staring at her back, his mind and soul overwhelmed by the realization that he was nothing. He was the one who had lost everything, and she was the one who had won without giving up a single part of herself. Only a shadow of remorse remained in his eyes, which, like an unbearable weight, could not be removed. He realized that all his words, all his aggression, and all his humiliation no longer made sense. He knew that even though he had tried to hold on to control, he was now nothing, just a small piece of the system that could not defeat its resilience. The woman was gone, but her struggle was not over. She remained on her path, her goal clearer than ever. She knew that the enemy changes form, but does not disappear. And in her mind, that was the most important lesson she had learned. Strength is not about winning every encounter, but about continuing to move forward despite everything that was tried to be taken away from her. She walked away, and with every step she took, it became clear. Her freedom, her journey to the truth was just beginning. What do you think about this story? Have you ever experienced racism or injustice in your life? Your opinion is very important to us, and we value each and every one of you. We are always happy to hear your thoughts and experiences. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like if you enjoyed it. We wish you a good day. Write the phrase, "The struggle continues," in the comments so we know you listened until the end.